Hello everyone, welcome to Easy Economics. How are you all doing? I hope you all are doing good. Today I brought for you all May June 2025 9708 paper 13. We'll be solving paper 1. Let's see what this paper has brought for us today. Moving forward, MCQ number 1. MCQ number 1 says a tourist visits a government owned tropical beach. She pays $10 to enter but finds it overcrowded. Now, which type of good is the beach? Now, if you look at the question, they are saying that she pays $10 to enter. However, she finds it overcrowded. Now, the options they've given us says it's a free good, it's an inferior good, a public good, or a private good. Now, although it's government owned, yet in order for this to classify as a public good, it must satisfy the two characteristics of non-excludability and non-rivalry. But since she's paying it, so that means the feature of non-excludability is not satisfied because unless you're going to pay for it, you're not allowed to be entering it. Plus, she also finds it overcrowded. So that means it's not a public good. It's not an inferior good because it got nothing to do with incomes over here. It's not a free good because a free good is a good which is not scarce and which has got zero opportunity cost. So it's not A, it's not B, it's not C. It's a private good. Now, why it's a private good? Because A, she's paying for it, and B, it's not a public good, right? So we are left with D. That's the correct answer. So for 1, we'll shade in D. Moving forward, MCQ number 2. MCQ number 2 talks about a PPC curve. Now, what they have done is they had actually displayed these points, and I have actually drawn the curve through the point M. Why? Because they said point M lies on the current tree's PPC, right? So I drew the curve in such a way that point M comes onto the boundary line. Now, they say point K, L, M, N, R, and S, they all represent different combinations of both capital goods and consumer goods. The vertical axis displays the capital goods, the horizontal displays the consumer goods. Now, they're saying point K cannot be achieved unless there is economic growth. So that means point K is a point that has to be outside the PPC, right? At the current moment, it's unattainable, right? Unless and until the country increases its productive potential. And how can it do that? It can do that only by increasing either the quantity or the quality of the factors of production, right? Now, they say point M lies on the country's PPC curve. So that's what I've done. Now, that means L, R, and S could be inside the PPC. S, L, R, and S are showing inefficiency, right? They are unemployed resources. Now, which 2 points must be on the opposite side of the country's PPC? So now, if you want something to be on the opposite side of the country PPC, that means you need to pick 1 point inside the PPC and you need to pick 1 point outside the PPC. So outside the PPC, you've got either K or you've got either N. And inside, you've got L, R, and S. So the possible combinations could be either you could pick K and R, or you could pick S and N, or you could talk about R and N, or you could talk about S and K. Now, looking at the options, they say K and N. K and N are all outside, so that's not the correct because we want to pick one inside and one outside. L and R, L and R are both inside. Again, it cannot be. N and R, N is outside, R is inside. Yes, that's the correct answer. D says R and S. Again, R and S are both inside, so it cannot be D. So for 2, we'll shade in C as the correct answer. I hope you understood. Don't get overwhelmed. MCQ number 3. MCQ number 3 says a firm produces 100 units of good Y and 200 units of good X with a fixed amount of resources. So what was the country doing? It was producing 100 units for good Y, and for good X, it was producing 200 units. Now, the firm wants to increase production of good Y to 120 units and As a result, it can now only produce 170 units of good X. So now, in order to produce 20 more units of good Y, it had to sacrifice 30 units for good X. The question is saying what's the opportunity cost of the extra 20 units? So the extra 20 units produced for good Y meant 30 units of good X sacrificed. That means for 3, we'll shade in B as the correct answer. Moving forward, MCQ number 4. MCQ number 4 says, what is the most likely benefit of specialization to a firm? That means when a firm decides to concentrate on the production of goods and services in which it is best at and employs division of labor. So what is the most likely advantage of a firm specializing? A says increase in motivation of employees. No, A cannot be correct because it leads to demotivation. It leads to monotony. B says increase in imports from other countries. No, when firms specialize, they tend to be self-sufficient and imports fall. C says increase in the number of employees. No, number of employees won't increase because each person is going to be getting perfect at a particular task, right? Specializing things, doing things in which they're best at. D says increase in the level of output. Yes, specialization would increase the output level. More goods and services will be produced, right? Productivity is going to increase. So for 4, we'll shade in D as the correct answer. Number 5. Number 5 says which row correctly identifies goods that would be expected to be produced in a mixed economy. So now they are saying you need to pick that combination which is expected to be produced in a situation of a mixed economy. So now we know mixed economy is an economy which employs both characteristics of a command and a market economy, right? So what it does is it tends to overcome the market failure that was occurring in market economy, right? The externalities that used to incur in market economies, it overcomes that. The first part of the column, this table, shows goods that are excludable and rival in consumption. That means private goods. The second part says goods that are non-excludable and non-rival. This means public good. And the last column says goods that have private and external benefits. That means private good. Right? So a mixed economy is one which provides private goods, which provides public goods, and goods that are excludable and rival in consumption, that has got private and external benefits, and goods which are all having benefits, right? So it would be providing all sorts of, all 3 of them, right? So this is merit good. This is merit good, that's private good. So it would be providing all 3 of them. So for 5, we'll shade in A as the correct answer. Moving forward, MCQ number 6. MCQ number 6 says a theatre has a fixed number of tickets to sell for each performance. What is the price elasticity of supply? So now when it has got a fixed number of tickets, so that means the price elasticity is perfectly inelastic. PES has to be 0. PES has to be 0. So when it's perfectly inelastic, that means no matter whatever happens to the price, the quantity of the tickets cannot be increased. You cannot increase the number of seats, right, in the theatre, right? So that means it has to be perfectly inelastic. For 6, we'll shade in B as the correct answer. Moving forward, MCQ number 7. MCQ number 7 says, it displays the demand in a supply curve. It shows the markets for computer in a country. Why is the equilibrium position? They're saying which area represents the consumer surplus. Now we know consumer surplus is the region in which we are talking about the excess price that the consumer is willing to pay over and above the equilibrium position, right? So it's any portion that is above the equilibrium and below the demand curve. So it's this triangular region. WXY. So for 7, we'll shade in A as the correct answer. Moving forward, MCQ number 8. MCQ number 8 says the diagram shows that the market demand and supply of foodstuffs for an economy. The economy has faced a decrease in the supply of foodstuff. So the supply has fallen, and at the same time an increase in demand for foodstuffs. So the demand is increasing. So if the demand is increasing, we'll be moving from D1 to D2, and if the supply is decreasing, we'll be moving inside upwards from S1 to S2. So looking at that position, we move from D1 to D2, and from S1 to S2, we'll arrive at point B. So for 8, we'll shade in B as the correct answer. Moving forward, MCQ number 9. MCQ number 9 says, what is true for income elasticity of demand but not for price elasticity of demand? Price elasticity of demand is percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price. That shows how responsive is price to changes in quantity demanded. Income elasticity is percentage change in quantity demanded relative to percentage change in income. So now they say what must be true for price elasticity, for income elasticity of demand, but not for price elasticity of demand. A says it helps firms differentiate between goods with elastic and inelastic demand. That both can tell. That can be told by both. So it's not A. It's B. That's the correct answer, because once we are talking about income elasticity of demand, the value plus the sign tells whether the good qualifies as an inferior good or a normal good, right? So when the elasticity for income elasticity demand, the value turns out to be a negative. So we come to know that it is an inferior good. Or if it is a positive number, so we come to know that it is a normal good, right? So as if the quantity demanded increases with the level of income, we say it's a normal good. But if it's false, even though if income is increasing, we say it qualifies as an inferior good, right? So for 9, we'll shade in B as the correct answer. It cannot be C, it cannot be D, because again, A, C, and D are all being told both in both the cases, in PED and in both income elasticity of demand as well. Number 10. MCQ number 10 gives us the supply demand for avocados in kgs. Now they displayed various prices and they're given quantity demanded and quantity supplied in each case. Now they're saying as a result of lower transport costs, the supply rises by 60 kg at all prices. Now for each price, the quantity supplied is going to increase, keeping the quantity demanded at the same level. So what you can do is you can add 60 to each quantity supply to arrive at the new quantity. So once you will add in the figures, what you will get is you'll get 290 over here, you'll get 250 over here, you'll get 210 when the price is 35, and you'll get 170 as the new quantity supplied after adding 60 kgs. So now, what is the equilibrium price? Equilibrium price is where the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. Hence, the price turns out to be $35. So that's option C. So for 10, we'll shade in C as the correct answer. I hope you've understood. Moving forward, MCQ number 11. MCQ number 11 displays the price elasticity of supply figure for a nuclear power plant. Now they say it's 0.1. It's a positive 0.1. Now notice it's a positive 0.1, which means it shows that it is what? It is very price elastic. It is very price inelastic. Not elastic, it's very price inelastic. So it's very inelastic. So it means that it's not relatively easy to respond to change in price. Right? So this means since it's a nuclear power plant, it requires trained specialist staff, right? It requires specific technology. So since it's very inelastic, the firm cannot easily find land, hence it cannot be A. The firm is not competing with other construction firms, it cannot be B. Yes, the firm requires time to hire skilled labor, that is why C is the correct answer. It cannot be D because D is talking about demand, and over here we are talking about supply. So it's not A, it's not B, it's not D. The correct answer has to be C. So for 11, we'll choose in C as the correct answer. Moving forward, MCQ number 12. MCQ number 12 says, which statement about maximum and minimum prices is correct? So for that, let's draw what happens when a country imposes maximum prices. Let's say this is the demand curve, this is the supply curve, and a maximum price is imposed where? Below the equilibrium. So what happens when a maximum price is imposed? There exists a shortage, and when a minimum price is imposed, which is above the equilibrium, there exists a surplus or an excess, right? Now, they're saying which statement about maximum and minimum price is correct. Now, let's read. With an effective maximum price, a shortage will develop. Yes, that's correct, because you see, when we are establishing a maximum price, which means that where are we? We are here. And a shortage is there, so that's correct. So for 12, we shade in A. Why can't it be B? There must have been something wrong in each statement now. Now see, with an effective maximum price, the market price will rise. No, the market price is not allowed to rise once we are imposing a maximum price. It cannot be effective, so it cannot be B. It cannot be C, because C says with an effective minimum price, rationing will be necessary. Minimum price has to be imposed above the equilibrium price. Rationing is not the situation in that. It cannot be D, because D says with an effective minimum price, the market price will fall. No, the market price has to be higher than the equilibrium price. That is why it has to be effective. So it's not B, it's not C, it's not D, it's A for number 12. Moving forward, MCQ number 13. MCQ number 13 says a flood control dam is an example of a good provided directly by government. So now it's being directly provided by government. Which statement relating to the direct provision of a flood control dam is not correct? That means 3 statements must be correct except for 1. Now, flood control provided by government, what does it looks like? It looks a public good, right? Now, if we read the options, C says it involves the supply of a merit good. No, it's not a merit good, it's a public good. So yes, the answer is C, because it's incorrect. A says it allows the government to tackle failure. Yes, it allows. B says it forces the government to incur an opportunity cost. Yes, once the government is going to decide to produce dams, it must have been foregoing the production or the provision of other goods and services. D says it's an example of government allocation of resources. Yes, that's an example. But what the question was saying, the question said which statement is not correct. A is correct, B is correct, D is correct. We wanted an incorrect statement. That is why we chose C, because they are saying flood control dam is a merit good. It's not a merit good, it's a public good. Therefore, we chose C as the correct answer to this MCQ. Moving forward, MCQ number 14. MCQ number 14 says a country depends heavily on the production of an agricultural product good X. It decides to introduce a buffer stock scheme for good X. Now, a buffer stock scheme is what? It involves buying and selling of stocks. Now, why does the government does that? In order to smoothen the price changes, right? It does not want fluctuation in the price. So now the government is opting for buffer stocks. The government allocates a fixed amount of money for setting up and running the scheme. Now, they're saying in which situation is the scheme least likely to run out of money. Least likely to run out of money means it wants the lowest financial burden. So the lowest financial burden means that if it's least likely to run out of money, so if you look at the table, it talks about 3 character traits, right? It talks about 3 dimensions: ability of new farmers to start growing this product, cost of storage, and the global demand. So the cost of storage has to be minimum, so that the government does not run out of money, so that it does not becomes a burden. So the cost of storage has to be low. So you can chop A, you can chop C. So the cost of storage has to be low, and the ability to farmers to start must be difficult. Why? Because if it's easier, so then it would be a financial burden because the government would keep on have to be actively involved in the buying and selling. So it has to be difficult, the cost of soil has to be low, and the global demand can rise, right? So that whatever is being produced, it's being automatically sold. It's automatically being purchased, right? No storage cost required. So for 14, we'll shade in D as the correct answer. Moving forward, MCQ number 15. MCQ number 15 displays an individual's income before and after income tax was imposed. Now notice the dashed line, the dotted line for 45 degrees is the pre-tax line and the solid line is the post-tax line. Now in order to find out which change to this income tax is most progressive, that means out of these four curves, which looks like the most progressive, you have to look for the curve which displays the widest gap between these two lines, right? So it cannot be A, it cannot be D because what happens, look at the horizontal axis is displaying the income before tax and the vertical shows the income after tax. So now as the level of income increases, the gap has to be widened. So in both B and C, the gap is widened, but notice it's in option C where the gap between these two lines is the widest and the proportion of tax paid increases as there is progression in the income level. So that means that the burden is being imposed more as on high income level group, right? So for this MCQ number 14 will shade in C as the correct answer. MCQ number 15 will shade in C as the correct answer. Moving forward. MCQ number 16. MCQ number 16 says which source of income is not included in measuring real GDP. When we are talking about real GDP, we are talking about changes in improvements in the standard of living. So that means there must have been services or goods produced against which there must have been payments made, right? So profits, rents, and wages are all included except for pensions because this talks about transfer payments against which no goods and services being produced, because it talks about pensions, it talks about unemployment benefits. So for 16, we'll shade in A because that's not involved, that's not included once you're talking about real GDP. So for 16, we'll shade in A as the correct answer. Moving forward, the table shows MCQ number 17, the table shows labor market statistics. Now they're asking us what is the unemployment rate. In order to calculate the unemployment rate, we'll pick in the level of people who are unemployed, we'll divide it by the amount of people in the labor force and we'll multiply it by 100. No, we'll not take the population. Total population is not to be taken, do not get confused. We'll pick 2 as in the numerator, the number of people unemployed divided by the total number of people in the labor force, and we'll multiply it by 100 and we'll arrive at 5%. So for 17, we'll shade in B as the correct answer. Moving forward, MCQ number 18. MCQ number 18 talks about an aggregate demand curve and an aggregate supply curve where the initial position was X. So this is where we were. AD was the initial aggregate demand curve. AS was the initial aggregate supply curve. Now what happened? The central bank forecasted a rise in raw material cost. So if the raw material cost is going to rise, aggregate supply is going to fall because it's going to get expensive. Cost of production is going to rise. The government decides to increase spending. So if the government decides to increase spending, aggregate demand is going to increase. So if aggregate supply fall, this means from AS we'll move to AS1. And if aggregate demand increases, that means from AD that we were initially, we'll move to AD2. So looking at these changes, we'll arrive at a situation of C. So for 18, we'll shade in C as the correct answer. Moving forward, MCQ number 19. MCQ number 19 says an economy is experiencing a period of deflation. Now, deflation is a situation of negative what? Inflation. What happens in this situation? The average price level falls, right? So, what happens that your level of average price levels is falling, right? So now Once there is negative inflation and the average price level is falling, we'll shade in A as the correct answer. But why it can't be B, C, and D? B says the output of the economy is falling. It has got nothing to do with the output. This MCQ, the rate of inflation is falling. The rate of inflation cannot be B, because if we are talking about the rate of inflation, this means we are talking about disinflation, right? So this means if initially the inflation was 10% and now if the inflation is 8%, that means even though the rate of inflation is falling, there's still inflation. There's still inflation. Inflation is still rising. But here they are saying it's deflation, and deflation is negative inflation where the average price level is falling. So it's not C, it's not B. D says the real value of money is falling. No, when we are talking about deflation, the real value of money rises and not falls. So it cannot be D. Therefore, the correct answer is A. Moving forward, MCQ number 20. MCQ number 20 says, what is the most likely consequence of economic growth? That means when economic growth happens, when we shift to a higher PPC, what happens? A fall in the price of the raw materials, not necessary. Not necessary. A rise in youth unemployment, no, unemployment falls, so it cannot be B. Worsening of the current account balance, yes, that's correct, because when economic growth is there, income level rises, imports increases, and exports fall. So for 20, we'll shade in C as the correct answer. It cannot be D because demand pull inflation increases and not falls. Moving forward, MCQ number 21. MCQ number 21 says a government wants to operate a tighter monetary policy. A tighter monetary policy means that either it wants to reduce money supply or it wants to increase interest rate. Now they are saying what would it increase? Now, what can it increase? It can increase the interest rate. As simple as that. So for 21, we'll shade in B. Why it can't be A? A is talking about budget surplus. It has got nothing to do with budget surplus at the moment, because budget surplus is related to government revenue and government expenses. We are talking about monetary policy over here. Money supply, it cannot increase money supply, it should be reducing money supply. The rates of taxation, taxation is talking about fiscal policy. So it cannot be B, C, it cannot be D. Moving forward, MCQ number 22. MCQ number 22 says which action is classified as a fiscal policy. Fiscal policy talks about government expenditure and fiscal policy talks about taxes. Now, A says fixing a currency, it's an exchange rate policy, so it cannot be A. B says tightening credit regulations on bank. So we are talking about fiscal policy over here, so it cannot be fiscal policy, but yes, tightening credit regulations for banks. But here, tightening credit regulation on banks, credit regulations on bank, it cannot be. B. C says providing guidance, it cannot provide guidance because guidance over here is not related to fiscal. Credit regulations on banks is related to money supply. It's related to monetary policy and not fiscal policy. That is why it cannot be B. C says providing guidance. Guidance is not related to fiscal or monetary policy. This is government is just providing guidance services. It's D where we're talking about managing changes in the level of government debt. So we are talking about spending. So we are talking about government expenditure. That is why it's related to fiscal policy. So for 22, we'll shade in D as the correct answer. Moving forward, MCQ number 23. MCQ number 23 displays government spending and government revenue over a 3-year period. They're talking about year 1, 2, and 3. They're talking about spending and revenue. So now what we can do is you will subtract the revenue from the spending. So over here, it was initially a surplus of 10. Here it was nil. Here it was a deficit of $15 billion. Right, so now what happened? A budget surplus became a budget deficit in year 3. So for 23, we'll shade in A as the correct answer. Moving forward, MCQ number 24. MCQ number 24 says which statement about supply side policies is correct? Supply side policy tends to increase the productive potential of the economy. It cannot be A because A is talking about aggregate demand. It cannot be B because yes, they do involve opportunity costs. It cannot be C because it says they reduce unemployment but they do not affect the price level. They do affect the price level. Yes, they can reduce unemployment. So that is why it's D. Because supply side policies increase productive potential when we produce, we employ more labor and it reduces the level of unemployment. It increases employment levels. So for 24, we'll shade in D as the correct answer. Moving forward, MCQ number 25. 25 says the government wants to reduce inflation, but for that it does not want to increase interest rate. Why might it not want to increase interest rate? It might not want to increase interest rate because increasing interest rate would mean that aggregate supply might fall. Why? Because then investors or producers would be discouraged to expand their production level. That is why the government might be reluctant to use increasing interest rate to cause the inflation to fall. So for 25, we'll shade in B. Why it can't be A? It can't be A because it increases interest rate to decrease inflation. It cannot be C because savings would increase if interest rate increases. It cannot be D because exchange rate would appreciate, more of that currency would be country's currency would be required because its interest rates are rising, people hot money inflows would occur. So it cannot be A, C and D. B is the correct answer. 26 says which argument in favor of protectionism is not generally accepted as valid. That means three are accepted except one. A is incorrect because that is valid. Because once the industry is protected, it would produce efficiently. B is valid because it talks about infant industry protection. Again, C is valid because yet it provides amount for the labor to get trained. But they are saying it is not valid. That is why D, because it increases standard of living of the population in general. No, everybody's standard of living might not be better off. Some sectors might be better off because it still leads to reduced choice. It still causes prices to increase, right? It causes dependency to increase. So for 26, we'll shade in D as the correct answer. Moving forward, MCQ number 27. 27 says a country has a deficit on its BOP. What would be expected to increase the deficit? Now, why would the deficit increase? The deficit would increase because in appreciation of the exchange rate. If exchange rate increases, that means exports would get expensive. So exports would fall and imports would rise because imports would get cheap. So for 27, we'll shade in A as the correct answer. Moving forward, 28 talks about an increase in import quotas of cars. So when import quotas increase, what happens? That means more imported cars are allowed. More imported cars are allowed. So if more imported cars are allowed, that means that the supply would increase. So if the supply would increase, that means the prices of cars will fall for domestic consumers, right? It cannot be A because jobs would fall. It cannot be C because specialization would increase and not decrease. It cannot be D because it might lead to retaliation, but they're saying most likely. Hence, it would be B because supply would increase. Now, 29 talks about terms of trade over 3 years. Now, notice the terms of trade has improved. Terms of trade is value of export prices upon value of import prices. So, if terms of trade has improved, this means that export prices relative to import prices have improved or risen. As a result, what would have happened? That means imports would have gotten cheap and raw materials could be cheap, right? So, the cost of production must have fallen. So, that means there would have been a decrease in cost push inflation. So for 29, we'll shade in A as the correct answer. Moving forward, MCQ number 30. MCQ number 30 talks about comparative advantage and it talks about absolute advantage. Now notice absolute advantage is a situation in which a country has can produce more of a good than other country with the same set of resources. And when you're talking about a comparative advantage, a country produces more of a good at a lower opportunity cost. So now notice country X has both advantages in production of both types of good, right? So it has got an absolute advantage in both types of good because it's producing more of mobile phones and it's producing more of TVs than country Y. So if you look at the options, they talk about country Y has an absolute advantage. So country Y does not have an absolute advantage. So you can choose C and D that very moment. Now, in order to decide whether country X has an absolute advantage, has a comparative advantage in which type of product, in mobile phones or in TVs, what we have to do is we need to calculate opportunity cost. We need to calculate opportunity cost. And how can we do that? For that, we need to find out opportunity cost of producing one TV for both country X and country Y, and we need to find out opportunity cost of producing one mobile phone. So we can talk about opportunity cost in this case, that if we keep phones over here and we keep TVs over here, so for country X it was 500, it was 400. So for opportunity cost of producing one phone would mean zero point 0.8, and for country Y it would mean 100 over here, 200 over here. So that means two TVs. So this means country X has a comparative advantage in production of TVs. What about country Y? Country Y, and if you're talking about, this is opportunity cost of producing phones. So country X has a comparative advantage in production of phones. Country For country X, the opportunity cost of one TV would be 500 upon 400, which means 1.25. And over here, it would be 100 upon 200, which means 0.5. So country Y has a comparative advantage in production of TVs, and country X has a comparative advantage in production of phones. So looking at the options, it's A, which says country X has an absolute advantage in the production of mobile phones and the comparative advantage in production of TVs. Hence, we'll choose A for MCQ number 30. I hope you have understood and you enjoyed solving this paper with me. Stay tuned, subscribe, happy learning.